Next subsection, colonialism and imperialism. After the colonization of the Americas, where did Europe turn collectively for colonization? And as you can see from this picture here, you could tell that the answer is Africa. When did this continent become decolonized? Now, even though the date on this map shows 1914, I don't want that to confuse you. That's not what we're looking at in regards to this area becoming decolonized. This area actually becomes decolonized between 1960 and 1990. That's the time period that this area becomes decolonized. After World War I, Africa is divided up. A split between European countries, and you can see this map here kind of shows you that. Not necessarily interested that you understand where countries were in regards to Africa, but it is important that you understand that European countries turned their colonization and imperialistic thoughts towards Africa. Next question. Despite Europe colonizing the Americas, what happened predominantly throughout the region? And the region we're talking about in this question is the Americas. What I mean by Americas is Latin America, Middle America, the Caribbean, and South America as well. Again, you can see dates on this map. It's not important for you to understand the specific countries and their dates in regards to independence. The answer I'm looking for in this question is a series of revolutions led to sovereignty for predominantly the whole region. In other words, this entire region, because of a series of revolutions, they reached their sovereignty, they reached their independence, the whole region of Latin America. After they becoming independent, you could kind of look at these dates here. After they become independent, then again, European countries turn their sights towards Africa in regards to their colonization efforts. Next question. What nation most deeply influenced imperialist policies during the 20th and 21st centuries? That is Great Britain. Number 3, democratization. Define democratization. Democratization is the process describing what most nations in today's world are undergoing. This is referring to switching government systems from whatever type of government there was, autocracy, for example, to a democratic nation. And predominantly, it's a global phenomenon that countries are changing, and that's what democratization means. Next question, describe the democratization process. The description of the democratization process is switching from an authoritarian to a democracy. It's a slow process. Slow. Doesn't happen immediately overnight, successfully anyways. Generally, after the authoritarian government is removed, a legislative body is set up. A legislative body is put into place before a president or prime minister enters the government. The government must provide its citizens with civil liberties, and elections must be free and open to citizens. Again, going back, the democratization process is slow. Generally, you have a legislative body that's set up before the president or prime minister comes into control, and this new democracy must ensure that the elections are free and open. Number 4, looking at the fall of communism and the legacy of the Cold War. First question, define economic restructuring. In the states of the former Soviet Union, economic restructuring was looking at a shift from communism to a free market. That's an example of it. The definition of economic restructuring is kind of looking at how the economies are changed and how their structures have changed. And again, a good example of that is the shift from a communist economic system to a free market economic system. Next question. In order to hold ethnic groups together in a region, what must there be in place? There has to be strong economic ties to hold these ethnic groups together, for these ethnic groups to have power in the economies as well as needs for each other's economic relationships. The strong economic ties have to be put into place for these ethnicities to be held together in regards to their jobs and those sorts of things. Again, strong economic ties. C2, fragmentation, unification, and cooperation. Now, I've kind of combined C1 and C2 here in regards to states' shapes. Define the following shapes of states. The first is fragmented. Fragmented is a state that is not contiguous not a contiguous whole, but rather separated parts. Again, a good example of that is when a country has islands on the outskirt. That country would then be fragmented because these islands are surrounded by water and they are not a part of the whole of that country. That's the most prominent example of a fragmentation state shape. Next, define prorupted. Prorupted is a type of territorial shape that has a narrow, long, elongated land extension leading away from the main body. That is what a prorupted is dealing with. Again, that's what this one's looking at with this long strip right here on the right. This would be prorupted because of this area here. Might be some resource available that these people are seeking for that border, but it has an extension there that makes it prorupted. Next is perforated. Perforated is a state that completely surrounds another state. That's the example here with E. This would be perforated. Again, South Africa and Lesotho is the example there. Next is compact. A compact state is a state where the distance from the center to any boundary does not vary significantly. And you can see the example there with A. Basically, it's small. That's pretty much what compact means. And then we have elongated. Elongated state is one with a narrow, long strip, like this example here with C. That's an elongated because it is long. I just now noticed B down here, my fragmented example with all of these islands. But again, elongated is here with C, a long, narrow strip. Next says make sure you have a real-world example of each. I'm not going to give you that in the review. Kind of a hint here that that's probably an FRQ question. So I would go and look some real-world examples of that up. You could find the names of these. You'll notice that I left the names out as we were talking about it. But I do have some in the notes, or better yet, just go find some examples of your own. Next, define a superimposed boundary. A superimposed boundary is just like the word says. It's a boundary line or a border line that's placed over and ignoring an existing cultural pattern. In other words, it's a boundary line that's placed over an area where the people have no say in it. Good example of a superimposed boundary is in Africa, where European nations, after they colonized the area, set up these borders, but then the cultures themselves did not have a say over it. So the borders and these boundary lines cross over different ethnicities even, and the African people have no say. Next is talking about describing the consequences of a superimposed boundary. We defined what it was. Now we're looking at the consequences of a superimposed boundary. And there's a lot of them. For a multinational or multi-ethnic state, a consequence could be separate nations within the same territory. For a multi-state nation, it could be a culture group that's split into pieces, maybe made into different minority groups. It could be internal struggles, could be an example. Increased likelihood of religious, ethnic, or tribal conflict if there was internal struggle. Maybe external struggle would be your consequence, as there's an increased likelihood of international, regional, or cross-border conflict. Could be a loss of culture, loss of language, loss of cultural traditions. Maybe a new language created, and maybe that new language becoming the official language or the lingua franca. Could be cultural syncretism coming into play, where culture groups mix and a dominant culture takes over. Maybe just there's migration as refugees and internally displaced peoples arrive. Could be government change. Could be loss or limited access to natural resources, maybe even ineffective governance. Or there could be political and economic hubs or diffusion patterns which extend from ports along coasts to points inland. These are any consequences that could come from this. So if this were an FRQ question, hopefully you could label 2 or 3 of these because it's plural. Hint, hint. Next says, explain how a landlocked nation will have troubles with economic viability. One is access to the sea. Lack of easy access to maritime trade or ocean resources could be a problem. Another is increased cost of imports due to customs, tariffs, tolls, distance, or even transportation costs that the nation surrounding it would play. Next is increased cost to export goods. Same thing. customs, tariffs, tolls, distance, or transportation costs by the bordering nation. Maybe there's limited road or rail transportation for imported goods in bulk. Maybe economic cooperation with the nation around you is not that well. And even vulnerability. You're cut off from global trade, cut off from political support, could be surrounded by hostile neighbors, and you could become economically dependent on the nation that you are actually surrounding. There's a good chance that your FRQ question is going to come from number 2. So make sure we take a look at that. Number 3, supranationalism and international alliances. Question reads, what do the European Union, the Arab League, and the United Nations all have in common? Answer, they are all supranational organizations. Number 2, why is the European Union a classic example of supranationalism? Because its member states had to transfer some of their powers to a central authority. Some of their sovereign powers they had to give over to a central authority to be part of the European Union so that they can be part of this multinational organization, which is a classic example of supranational organization. Compare NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Both of these are military alliances. Both of these were set up during the Cold War. NATO still exists today, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Warsaw Pact dissolved, literally, with the dissolving of the Soviet Union, because the Warsaw Pact was pretty much just Soviet Union nations. Number 4, define devolution. Devolution is when a nation gives some of its central power to regional governments. Devolution happens more often than not in unitary nations because federal nations are already devolved. Number 5, electoral geography. Define gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a practice in which a political party attempts to gain an unequal advantage by changing the boundaries of a legislative district. Now remember, gerrymandering occurred when Elbridge Gerry signed a bill which approved the redistricting of a Massachusetts voting party. One of the districts looked like Salamander. You can see his salamander here. Now again, it doesn't really look like salamander to me. It kind of looks like a dragon. Maybe it should be called Jerry Dragoning. I guess that didn't have quite a ring as gerrymandering, but that's what gerrymandering looks like, and that's why it's called gerrymandering, because Eldridge Gerry divided up the voting districts of Massachusetts voting territory, and it ended up looking like a dragon. A salamander, not a dragon. And number 6, armed conflicts, war, and terrorism. First is define what terrorism actually means. Terrorism is intimidating a group of people through violence. You're looking for a reaction from civilians. It's an attack generally on civilians, trying to scare them, trying to coerce them into changing government action on something. It's always through violence. A lot of times you use social media nowadays to do that, terrorists do. Now, next question. What does the inner crescent have to do with Cohen's shatter belt theory? Now, you're probably wondering why I've got a picture of the Heartland-Rimland theory up. The inner crescent area of the Heartland-Rimland theory is the Middle East. Cohen predicted that after 1950, armed conflict would likely occur here. He's saying that after the year 1950, there would be fighting again in the Middle East. He was absolutely correct. Still today, we have fighting in the Middle East. There's a terrorist group called ISIS that has controlled this region and that is fighting in this region. And that's definitely after 1950, like Cohen predicted.